Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to wait just a minute because we're starting right on time here, and I want to allow people to join us. All right, looks like people are rolling in. So again, welcome. My name is Emily Stewart, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. And we're very excited to be hosting this important event today. And also want to encourage everyone to read Dr. Roberts' book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority. And you can receive a 30% discount when you purchase the book before April 30th by using the code SROB. And I will post that information in the chat as we move forward during the event, so everyone can have an opportunity to access that. Before we begin, I want to mention that over the last year, students from the Native American Student Alliance, staff, faculty from Duke, UNC, NC State, and members of local Native nations have been participating in the Land Acknowledgement Committee. And the purpose of this committee is to center Native students' intentions in creating land acknowledgements and to consult with local Native tribes about the practice of reading them in a university setting. So I want to honor that we are still in this process, and I won't give a formal land acknowledgement now, but invite everyone to learn more about the land you live on and the Native people who currently still live there or who have historically lived there. And I'll put something in the chat. It's a helpful map as a starting point and a resource for creating land acknowledgements. So let's dive in. We won't have live captioning during the event, but we will add closed captions to the video before uploading it to YouTube next week. And there will be an opportunity to ask questions, so please feel free to send those through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions about the Duke Human Rights Center, or if you're having problems with Zoom, please reach out directly to me via the chat. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Nancy McLean, who is the William H. Chafe Distinguished Professor of History and Public Policy and a member of the Duke Human Rights Center's Executive Committee. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Emily. Good afternoon and welcome. It's wonderful to see so many people interested in today's crucial conversation. We've had almost 200 registrants, and we're very much looking forward to being able to share today's speakers with you. I'm Nancy McLean, and as Emily said, I'll be moderating today. After our speakers converse for about 50 minutes to give us foundational information for what I know will be a fruitful discussion, I'll monitor the Q&A to share your thoughts and questions with them. When the executive board of the Duke Human Rights Center met last September, we agreed that our programming this year must address what is arguably the worst and most systematic and calculated violation of human rights in our time: what the Chinese government is doing to its Uyghur minority. In fact, just last week, the Canadian Parliament voted unanimously across party lines, 260 to 0, to condemn China's treatment of its Uyghur minority population as a genocide. In the words of one of the backers of the motion that are worth quoting here today, he said it was important to send a clear and unequivocal signal that we will stand up for human rights and the dignity of human rights, even if that means sacrificing some economic opportunity. Even if it means sacrificing some economic opportunity. That's important because if China did not have so much foreign direct investment, the international condemnation of what is happening now would likely be overwhelming, given the voluminous evidence. Indeed, some in this afternoon's audience heard firsthand testimony earlier today from a Duke alumna, Aydin Anwar, a Uyghur American with over 90 relatives missing in China's mass surveillance and incarceration system. As we at DHRC considered how best to inform our community about these attacks on the Uyghur people, we quickly concluded that we should invite Dr. Sean Roberts, one of the world's foremost experts on the Uyghur people and their recent treatment by the Chinese state. We are thrilled that he agreed to come. Dr. Roberts received his PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Southern California. He is currently the director of the International Development Studies MA program at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. His regional expertise is in Central Asia, and he has done extensive research on the Uyghur people in the People's Republic of China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, as well as in Central Asia and Turkey. Professor Roberts has been studying Uyghur culture, history, and politics for almost 30 years, ever since his first trip as a student to the Uyghur homeland in 1990. I urge you to visit his richly illustrated website to see the variety of materials he has produced, including a documentary and policy papers. Today, though, he is here to speak on his 2020 book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority. I will speak for myself as a reader. I found this book to be revelatory. It taught me so much, and page after page, what he was reporting took my breath away. Not only does the book convey the enormity of what is happening to the Uyghur people with abundant documentation, it also explains carefully and systematically why the Chinese government is doing what it's doing to them and how it has gotten away with it so far. That escape from accountability is a story that we in the United States bear some responsibility for, owing to the specious cover provided by the US global war on terror and to the enabling investments by US corporations such as Nike and Apple and Google and Facebook, as I'm sure Professor Roberts will share. The War on the Uyghurs is the rare work of scholarship that is timely on an urgent issue. So I encourage you to take advantage of the link in the chat and get and read the whole of this vital book. Here to talk with Professor Roberts today is one of Duke's own experts in related areas and an ideal interlocutor, Dr. Mustafa Tuna, Associate Professor of Slavic and Eurasian Studies and History. Professor Tuna's research focuses on the Muslim communities of Central Eurasia since the early 19th century, and he is particularly interested in identifying the often intertwined roles of Islam, social networks, state or elite interventions, and the globalization of European modernity in transforming Muslim communities. We at DHRC are very grateful to Professor Tuna for joining us in this crucial dialogue with Professor Roberts. After they wrap up, I will pose audience questions to them from the Q&A. So please use the link to that to raise your questions as they arise. Professor Tuna?
Hello. Hi. Thank you, Nancy and Emily, for the introductions. And Dr. Roberts, thank you for being here. It is your work that we want to share today. And hopefully I'll try to be the vehicle to highlight your work. So how shall we start? I'll share Nancy's thoughts as a reader, finding your book so revelatory. I've been involved in this, of course, for a while. It is part of what I study, but I did learn a lot from book. And also the narrative that you provide that puts many things together in a coherent, understandable way that should make sense to whoever reads it is really useful. So I'll say this as a way of introduction. I think this book talks to us, explains us two tragedies. One is a human tragedy, what you call the cultural genocide of the Uyghur people in China's northwest. And the other is what perhaps we can call a tragedy of humanity. And that is the creation of a post-rights world, in your terms, in the context of the global war on terror. Now, we all know that the global war on terror was developed in response to a heinous act of terrorism, but it did not directly target or even eliminate terrorism in the world. And instead, it did two things that we seem to be bearing the consequences of today. One was the justification of two invasions, those of Iraq and Afghanistan. And the other was the shoving of human rights in the name of counterterrorism activity. And importantly, by the liberal democracies of the world. Now, when the liberal democracies of the world shelved human rights in this name, in the name of countering terrorism, the illiberal, non-democratic regimes of the world were even more ready to do the same and take this as a green light to go ahead and do whatever they wanted to do among and to their populations. And as we all know, human rights did not just happen. It was the recognition of human rights as human rights was the outcome of the conscious and purposeful acts of individuals and governments. And it became a widely known fact by around, let's say mid-20th century. But in this context, they are being erased. It was never perfect. It did not eliminate all evil, but it carried a moral cloud. And in the post-rights world that you are describing in your book, that moral cloud is being undermined, allowing whole categories of people to be dehumanized, right? So human rights are still there, but this gives an opportunity to states and other entities to dehumanize categories of people, to, in a sense, push them to under what humanity is, almost going back to the Untermensch of the Nazis, right? So these people, as if it appears they don't deserve human rights. And the cultural genocide of the Uyghurs is taking place in this context. Ascription of causality is, of course, a very difficult thing and can become too precise. But the question here is not what caused the cultural genocide of the Uyghurs. It is what made it possible and what is our share in this. So to that background, I will ask you a few questions, but recognizing that not all of our audience may know about the Uyghurs and their plight in China, perhaps we should first start with some introduction about who these people are and why are we here today? Why are we talking about them today? So let's start from there. Who are the Uyghurs? Where do they live? Why does it matter that where they live is a special place in China, and how did we come to this point?
Thank you. So the Uyghurs are a Turkic-speaking Muslim people. They number about 11 million by official statistics in the People's Republic of China. But historically, they really have much more connection with the people of Central Asia, the different peoples of Central Asia. Their language and culture is very closely related to that of the Uzbeks of Uzbekistan. There's a long history of Uyghurs moving back and forth from Central Asia to their homeland, which is arguably part of Central Asia. They became part of, well, that area has been a crossroads of empires historically. And at times it's been the center of different empires. But in the modern period, really where it comes into the orbit of modern China is through its conquest by the Qing Dynasty, which is in the 18th century. And then there's a period where it's really just more of a protectorate. And by the 1880s, the Qing Dynasty really tries to make it a part of China, which then kind of rolls into the post-imperial period, Republican China and the People's Republic of China, which essentially inherited the borders of the Qing Empire. And I think another important point for those people who are interested in Soviet Central Asia, I think that there's a big part of the story why Uyghurs have had a different experience on the Chinese side of the border is China's never really recognized the aftermath of empire. In the Soviet Union, you can argue about how sincere it was, but there was a recognition that different people lived on territory that was their homeland, and that there had been excesses during Russian colonialism. And the Soviet system was essentially a type of federation, right? in China, Chinese Communist Party ended up terming the region where Uyghurs consider their homeland the Uyghur Autonomous Region, but that didn't really have with it any sort of difference in governance in terms of representation of Uyghurs. And I think even more importantly, since about 1959, the Chinese Communist Party has held a line saying that this area has always been part of China, and Uyghurs are not the indigenous people of this region. Which really kind of it denies them that kind of recognition that this is their homeland. And I think that that's a very important point in terms of the difference.
Who would be the indigenous people of the region? Is there any suggestions about that by the party?
Well, the party, says that, which of course is true historically, that Turkish people came into the region. But I think the more questionable assertion is that this has always been part of China, which is, I think this is, it's kind of beyond my competencies, but I'm hoping that some China scholars will look at this more closely. I think it has a lot to do with how China envisions itself, that the way that China has gone about nation building, it has been very, very reluctant to undertake this idea of kind of a multinational state. And it very much holds to this idea that this is a Chinese nation state, although even the Chinese nation is very splintered linguistically and culturally and so on. But in terms of international law, when people talk about the rights of indigenous peoples, it's really talking about the people during the major era of colonialism, which corresponds with the period when this region was essentially became part of China, the people who were living in those areas then. So, I think archaeologists would agree that there are very few people who are completely indigenous as having been the original inhabitants. The Uyghur people, certainly, although they speak a Turkic language, are an amalgamation of different peoples who inhabited that area, just as is the case with all of Central Asia. And, the first recorded inhabitants were allegedly Indo-European to the degree that we know that.
So we are not, and we don't have to be thinking about a pure blood people who have not mixed with anybody. This is a region which is at the crossroads of an important route between China and Central Asia, and from there all the way to Europe. And peoples have been going and coming and settling and moving on. There's an amalgam of peoples, but that said, there still is a sufficient shared cultural material in terms of language and religion, right? Islam, that justifies the calling of these people something, even though the name may have been invented later on, as all nations and nation states have appeared in history. From your book, I remembered. Go ahead.
I was just going to mention it as well. One thing that's, I think, a unique aspect of Uyghur culture, it's something that they share with the Uzbeks also, is that there's a very intense relationship with locality. The historians would talk about the peoples of Central Asia prior to the 20th century as not having nations, because when travelers would speak with them, they would ask them who they are, and they would say, I am a Kashgarlik, which means inhabitant of Kashgar. But that was that's always been an important part of their identity. And, that's one of the reasons this connection with territory, I think, is important.
I remember from your book this image that, that's attributed to Xi Jinping as, China like a pomegranate, and all peoples in the pomegranate being, sticking together like seeds. But of course, the the metaphor and the image brings to our mind that all those seeds need to look alike. They need to be the same. And it seems that there is something about the Uyghurs that is not fitting in, or that is being perceived as not fitting in from Beijing. So what is it that makes them a problem for the Communist Party and the Chinese state today?
I mean, I think it's on multiple levels. One is if there's actually really a racial dimension to this, and that they are one of the few people that would have difficulty passing as Han, few non-Han people in China. The Uyghurs have very diverse physical features. So they stick out very, very significantly from physical features as being different. I think that it was always, until very recently, I would say until the last 30 years or so, it was really seen as a frontier of China. And so it hadn't really been developed to the extent as the rest of China. And although there were periodic campaigns of assimilation, the Uyghurs had always resisted assimilation. In fact, I remember in the 1990s speaking with Uyghurs as they were kind of starting to explore their religion more intensely, and they were saying, many of them would say, one of the reasons I am so attracted to Islam is because I think that's one of the only ways we can ensure that we are not assimilated. They would hark back to history, talking about how the Manchus had kind of disappeared into the Han Chinese ethnos that that a large segment of the Mongolian peoples did, and so on. And so I think that this, I guess to some degree, the Uyghurs have also very much sought to differentiate themselves. They feel that they have a unique culture, and they've been so distanced from inner China for most of history that they've maintained this distinct identity, this distinct culture, and they don't really have any desire to assimilate. That being said, prior to the current crisis, you did have a lot of Uyghurs taking the opportunity to participate in modern Chinese society, getting educated in China, becoming fluent in Chinese language, seeking to work inside China, not necessarily in their homeland. But even in doing that, I think there was always this sense of differentiation. So, I mean, some of the people who've gone to Chinese boarding schools since the 1990s came out of these schools saying, now I feel that I'm neither Chinese because the Chinese don't entirely accept me as one of them. I'm always another, but I'm also not entirely Uyghur because I've lost a lot of my traditions and my language. And so, in some ways, I kind of see their predicament as something that is seen in a lot of people who've undergone colonialism, where on one hand, the colonial power wants to integrate them, but is never willing to integrate them on their own terms. And so they always end up being forever in other in the eyes of kind of the colonial metropole.
So from the point of view of the metropole, it is not about the willingness and ability of the Uyghur people, for civic engagement, but rather they need to be assimilated.
Yeah, I think that's there was a brief period during the 1980s, after the Cultural Revolution in China. It was a liberal time throughout China, and I think that's what has led to a lot of the hopes outside of China that China was evolving towards a more liberal order. During that period, there was a sense that Uyghurs were allowed to engage in their uniqueness, and while still embracing being part of China. You can imagine an alternative universe if that had continued. it might be a very different outcome. Because I think that states are complicated and they have lots of different groups within them. But if if you cannot allow people to join and participate in society on their own terms, it's likely to lead to friction and conflict.
Mm-hmm. And it eventually, did lead to friction and conflict in China. And I understand from your book that, especially when we hit the 1990s, what seems to have defined the Chinese metropole's view of the Uyghurs is some kind of fear. What did they fear in the 1990s?
So in the 1990s, I think it was a very significant event for the Uyghurs and for the Chinese Communist Party was the fall of the Soviet Union. And the Chinese Communist Party looked at the fall of the Soviet Union and wanted to avoid a similar fate. And I think they really wrongly diagnosed the problem. They decided the problem was that that the Soviet Union had allowed ethnic groups to thrive, to have their own identities, and that it was this kind of friction between ethnic groups that brought down the Soviet Union. Now, people who study the Soviet Union and its history know that it was much more an economic collapse. And in fact, in Central Asia, none of the states wanted to leave the Soviet Union, and Russia just told them, you're now independent, right? So, but from that point on, there was a real, increase. It was an increasing tension throughout the whole decade, where the Chinese government was looking for separatists within the Uyghur population. So it was suspicious of any kind of political voice. When you would have protests in inner China during the 1990s and even into the 2000s, the state would often respond by saying, this is a grievance that needs to be taken care of. If there was a protest in the Uyghur region, it was immediately assumed that this was separatism. So it kind of closed any kind of civic space for Uyghurs. And at the same time, because Uyghurs had this long connection with Central Asia, and during the 1990s, they were able to travel there. A lot of people were trading, doing cross-border trade. They saw these independent states and started to think about the possibility that this area of China could become an independent state someday.
Hmm. So it looks like a prescription to push people to want to separate. Were there people who wanted to separate? I mean, you said for some people, but did this turn into activism?
Well, I think part of the problem was the political space was so closed that you couldn't really have much activism. It was a lot more of kind of James Scott's everyday resistance type of things that you would come across. People would musicians would write songs that were cryptically critical of the party. There was one I met who had been driven out of the country, who had written a song about the guest who came and would never leave. And he described a very funny encounter with the Public Security Bureau where they were saying, we know this is about China. And he'd say, no, this is a traditional idea among Uyghurs. We have hospitality and guests sometimes take advantage of that. But they put this public security in an awkward position to say, yes, we are the guests who came and would not leave.
Yeah.
So you had some of that, and you had some people who I think desired the idea of an independent state, but you didn't have any organized kind of resistance, and certainly not an organized militant resistance. You did have occasional violence. Most of it was protests that were suppressed, assuming that they were expressions of separatism. Sometimes it was kind of clashes between Uyghurs and law enforcement, as law enforcement would accuse Uyghurs of separatism or arrest family members. And there were two bus bombings in the 1990s. They could have been terrorist attacks, but no specific group claimed them, and a lot of the information around them remains very shrouded in secrecy. So there wasn't really, there was not a sense that there was a separatist movement, in the country, even if you had a lot of people who maybe had sentiments that they would prefer to be separate from China.
Mm-hmm. So we have to, maybe summarize things. We have a relatively large region somewhere in Eurasia occupied by Turkic-speaking Muslim peoples who gradually come to identify themselves as Uyghurs. And then we have the colossal Chinese state occupying or invading the region in the mid-18th century, almost accidentally, but that's a different story, and staying there. And as we move on to the 20th century, the communist revolution in China, the Communist Party starting to define the Chinese people, going through the experience of especially the Cultural Revolution, which was quite a shaker that transformed China. The Uyghur people are not necessarily shaken by that experience, and they do not necessarily fit into this nation state, homogenizing nation state model in China. And their difference starts to be perceived as separatism, an act against the state in the 1990s. Maybe there are a few events here and there, but the activism does not define the Uyghur people in the 1990s. It is sentiments that we are talking about, and these sentiments are responses to the effort of the state to homogenize, assimilate the population. But then we move on to the 2000s, and the trajectory of the events that bring us to today and the tragedies of today seem to be completely different. Here we are talking about terrorism, Islamic extremism. How did that happen?
Well, so, it's interesting. One of the things I uncovered when I was looking at this in more depth in the research for my book is, in some ways, it even slightly predates 9/11. And I think it starts basically with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And as China is working with the Central Asian states and Russia, they begin talking about not only economic cooperation, but security cooperation. And for China, their real concern is Uyghur activism, because there's also a lot of Uyghurs in Central Asia, and they're actually much more, they're much louder in terms of their advocacy for independence of a Uyghur state. But at least they were in the 1990s. And at the same time, when they talk to Russia and the Central Asian states, they're talking about terrorism. Russia's, has labeled the Chechens as terrorists. Uzbekistan has labeled a group of domestic opposition as terrorists. And, Central Asia is on the footsteps of Afghanistan, which is where at this time already, it is becoming associated with international terrorism. And so you see actually the Shanghai Cooperation Organization just, I think a month before 9/11, establishes a covenant on separatism, extremism, and terrorism, which becomes this idea of the three evils. And then when 9/11 happens, the Chinese government immediately sees kind of the international context changing, whereas the label of terrorist becomes almost anathema. It becomes a sign of, kind of evil incarnate. And as you said in the kind of prelude, becomes a kind of a sign of being less than human. And the Chinese government, having, been criticized frequently about crackdowns on Uyghurs, sees that this would be a very convenient kind of label to give to what it now considers its Uyghur problem, right? So they release several policy papers where they basically list every Uyghur diaspora organization imaginable and says that they're all part of an umbrella terrorist organization that is funded by Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. And I think Western states initially don't really react to this at all because a lot of them know some of these organizations. In fact, the US for almost a year in communiques continually points out that the Uyghur issue is not about terrorism. It's about, the rights of a minority, the ability of China to tolerate difference and so on. And then suddenly in the summer of 2002, the US decides to recognize one Uyghur group as a terrorist group. And it's a group that's mentioned in this white paper, which is the term the Chinese use for these official policy papers in the state, that is in Afghanistan. And at the time, everybody who was studying Uyghurs or this region of China or Central Asia had never heard of this organization. So it seemed very suspicious, but kind of to add insult to injury, when the US State Department recognized this group, the Chinese policy papers had outlined 200 alleged terrorist attacks, which was a kind of a litany of any kind of violence in the Uyghur region during the 1990s, and said that all of these had been the work of this nebulous network of multiple organizations, terrorist organizations. And the US State Department blamed that all on this one yet unknown group in Afghanistan, which it called the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, or ETIM.
Were they organized in Eastern Turkestan itself?
Well, so, when I started research for this book, it was prior to the present crisis. And so I was really looking at this whole question. Did this group exist? What was its evolution, and so on? And also, what was the impact of this group being recognized internationally as a terrorist group? And so my research showed that the group was basically the vision of one person, somebody who in the 1980s, when it was particularly liberal time in the region, had become interested in Islam. He studied with the famous Uyghur religious scholar. And this scholar himself had been somewhat influenced. He'd been in Chinese prison for 30 years when he was allowed out in 1980. But he had
There must have been a cultural shock.
Yeah. I mean, from what I can tell, he was actually influenced by Muslim modernist ideas from the 19th century, early 20th century, kind of going back to the Jadid ideas of modernist nationalism with an Islamic face. Because he was teaching not only religion, but he was teaching the history of Eastern Turkestan, which is a term Uyghurs use to refer to this region. He was teaching vernacular literature, Uyghur literature, and these were things that were popular in the late 19th, early 20th century in Central Asia among Muslim reformers. So he was not influenced by Salafism or the same kind of things that al-Qaeda or the Taliban were influenced by. And but he ends up leaving China in 1998 because he was under a lot of duress. It was a period where there were crackdowns on people who were studying Islam or practicing Islam outside of any kind of official channels. And he has an idea to start an army to liberate the homeland, inspired by religion. And he decides he wants to go and establish this in Afghanistan. And he goes to Saudi Arabia and Turkey to talk to Uyghurs in diaspora and doesn't get any support, but he goes to Afghanistan anyways with only a few followers. And once there, they're able to kind of set up some sort of community. But actually, one thing is he has very trying relationship with al-Qaeda, because al-Qaeda is not interested in his agenda. He's not interested in al-Qaeda's agenda. He, by all accounts, seems to have been more or less quarantined by the Taliban, because in 1999, the Chinese Foreign Ministry enters into agreements with the Taliban that include making sure that there's no Uyghur groups in Afghanistan that could cause problems for China. So this group really never, to my knowledge, it never carries out any violence anywhere. It did have the intent to, form a, national liberation army, but was, very bad at doing that. It was a complete failure.
So did this, I'm sorry. So this one man and perhaps a few followers group of people that is now recognized as a terrorist organization by the international community is quarantined in Afghanistan because Taliban is looking to China for some benefits. But what's happening in China itself?
In China, it's still very much this focus on separatism. What happens, at one point I think that's worthwhile mentioning is that the US recognition of this group and its sudden kind of about face in policy, there's no declassified evidence of this, but many analysts see this as being a concession to China to make sure that China in the UN Security Council does not object to the US invasion of Iraq. Because it is very odd that all of a sudden the US recognizes this group. But once the US recognizes it, China does use Interpol against various Uyghurs activists in diaspora. The person who is today the president of the World Uyghur Congress, Dolkun Isa, the Chinese government suggests that he has connections with ETIM, and therefore he gets a red notice from Interpol that created problems for him traveling. But within China, I think it's more just initially just a discursive shift. The same policies are essentially in place. The state is actually doing more development in the region. And it's continuing to crack down on expressions of religion outside official institutions, on any signs of disloyalty. But instead of calling it separatism now, it's calling it terrorism. But it's an important fact that between that time, 2002 and 2008, the Chinese government does not report any significant violence in the region. There's really no disruptions in the region in that period, which kind of is demonstrative of the extent of whatever threat there was. But at the same time, it gets less criticism of any kind of actions it does, because it's under the umbrella of this kind of internationally accepted counterterrorism strategy.
So one action that it does at this time is to try to crack down on the diaspora Uyghurs who are in various countries and try to limit their or restrict their voices and criticism against China. And what's happening in terms of their actions in China, as far as I understand, there is a shift from what you called a frontier colonialism to settler colonialism, and the appearance of life in Eastern Turkestan seems to be changing at this time.
Yeah, no, and I think that shift begins maybe happening in the 1990s, but the resources are not really there yet in the Chinese state to develop this region. I think to your point, there's two different kind of things happening. On the one hand, China, the Chinese state, as early as the 1990s, looking at this region and seeing it as a very important strategic region that it wants to develop. And it throughout the 90s and even into the first decade of the 2000s, it assumes that the way it can do that is incentivize assimilation for quote unquote good Uyghurs and to severely punish disloyal Uyghurs. That kind of continues in the 2000s, just that the discourse switches from being separatist to being extremist and terrorist, which gains more kind of recognition internationally as a legitimate thing to do.
Does life become more suffocating for the Uyghur people in Eastern Turkestan too, as a result of these?
Yes, for some people, for some of the elite, they benefit from development. But for a lot of people, they don't. And in particular, in the southern area of the region where it's mostly agricultural, they're not benefiting from this development. Most of the development is really infrastructure based. It's allowing for more connectivity with the inner part of China. And initially, most of the development is in the north, where there's already a lot of Han population. But of course, this development also attracts more in-migration. Not kind of state-led in-migration, but essentially market-led. This is the new frontier. This is an opportunity, and the state provides some incentives for people to even move there and begin participate in the development, found companies, found production units, and so on. So the places where Uyghurs and Chinese and Han are meeting in that process become definitely more tense, and it becomes more suffocating. And there's increasing attempts by the state already during this period to chip away at Uyghur language instruction. Officially, it's termed bilingual education, but essentially it becomes a Chinese language-based education system. So you have the younger generation growing up speaking Chinese, which in the 1990s was not the case. I mean, I used to travel in the region only knowing Uyghur and not Chinese, and I would find very few Uyghurs who spoke Chinese, and I could easily travel just knowing Uyghur, never encountering any problems.
So I started teaching in 2009, and one of the first things that I had to teach about was the Urumqi riots, which happens, in the summer of 2009. In that context, where the Han are moving into the region, could you say a few things about that and the outcomes of those events?
Yeah, I mean, I think those events were a major turning point. What happens is that initially, there are some protests in Urumqi that are responding to the death of several Uyghur workers in a factory in the south of China. Another thing that already at this period the Chinese government was doing was, these were mostly voluntary programs, but you could join these programs to work in factories in China. And that was one attempt to kind of incentivize assimilation.
Mhm.
And a rumor had spread around the factory that a Uyghur man had raped a Chinese woman, and then there was a group that went to the dormitory where the Uyghur man was and killed several Uyghurs. And so there was a protest that was mostly organized by students carrying signs in the Chinese language, carrying Chinese flags, basically asking for justice to this, to be served in this case. And it's met with a crackdown by security forces, and it eventually degrades into ethnic violence, street violence. And I kind of view the riots as an outcome of development. You have this this massive development happening in the region. It's bringing more Han into the region. It's making a lot of the Uyghurs feel that they're being suffocated by the increased Han presence. And I think on both sides, there's a lot of tension because, a lot of the Han going out there are expecting great opportunities and so on. And they're finding it, not always as hospitable as they had hoped.
Mhm.
And it really degrades into Uyghur on Han and Han on Uyghur violence for about 3 days. And if you talk to a lot of Han about this to this day, if you talk about the Uyghur issue, they'll immediately point to this incident. I think it had a significant, it kind of shook a lot of Chinese people in terms of their confidence in the stability of the region, and really kind of helped to reconfirm this idea of Uyghurs as a dangerous population. And the state very much blamed the Uyghurs for the violence. They didn't at the time, there was some kind of accusations of terrorism, but I think, for anybody looking at it, they could see that this was spontaneous violence. This was not, planned political violence. It was not a terrorist act. It was not connected to Islam in any way. But they blame Uyghurs, and in particular, they blame the rural Uyghur labor migrants from the south who were in Urumqi at the time. And that leads to a year-long crackdown. They completely shut down the internet and international communications in the region. They start going house to house and rounding up Uyghurs. To this day, some of the Uyghurs who are reported being imprisoned or put into internment camps, they'll list among their crimes having participated in this event.
Mhm.
And it really began a very dark period in the South, Uyghur majority, more agricultural communities, where the state had a constant presence and was putting significant pressure on people. They were doing spot checks on houses, just random searches of people's houses. And some people, particularly religious people, have told me that they felt they were essentially under house arrest.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and
And this also is taking place, we need to keep in mind, in the context of the global war on terror. The label of terrorism is a pass for many things that the governments can do to individual citizens, and that also seems to be happening. People being labeled as terrorists, and any kind of violence being registered as a terrorist activity. And from there we move to the mid 2010s, and it looks like as you mentioned, the escalation takes new goes to new stages that we could not even imagine, that now look like 1984 coming true. And how did that happen?
Well, I think this crackdown was sustained in the South, and in particular in rural communities, and so you had this kind of escalating violence between security law enforcement and Uyghur civilians, right? So you would have instances where people, the police would come and search a house, and the details are not known, but you can kind of see some sort of conflict emerge. There's some reports of policemen finding somebody veiled and lifting their veil, and just the kind of intrusion on the people's lives. You had violent clashes between Uyghur civilians and police, and people would end up dead, usually the Uyghurs, occasionally a policeman or two. And the state would continually frame these as terrorist attacks. And one of the things I think that was particularly corrosive about the narrative of there being a terrorism threat from Uyghurs was it portrayed this, even though originally, and then later there's another group of small group of Uyghur militants who do become aligned with al-Qaeda, but have no reach into China. But the Chinese government portrays this as being kind of a disease within the community itself, within the people, that has to be rooted out. And I think you could even say that in many ways you could see this happening unintentionally, where people who have no understanding of Islam, they associate any kind of Islamic behavior as this is a sign of this existential threat of terrorism. So the situation got very, very bad in the south of the region. You had thousands of Uyghurs fleeing the country illegally through Southeast Asia during this time, mostly from rural communities. And you start to see a couple acts of violence that look like premeditated political violence, that look like what I would term terrorism, even though it's important to point out that there's no international consensus on the definition of what terrorism is.
How does this correlate with the consolidation of central power in China with the coming to power of Xi Jinping?
So that happens, it does correspond pretty much exactly with that, right? So 2013, you see the first act of violence that, may be interpreted as terrorism. A Uyghur family drives a SUV into Tiananmen Square and seems to be intentionally hitting people, running them over, right? And then in 2014, we see a couple instances that are much more violent. And this is just the same time that Xi Jinping is rising to power. And he takes a trip to the region in 2014. And just as he's leaving the region, there's a bombing at the Urumqi train station. And many people see this as like a kind of the point where the party decided that the Uyghur problem had reached its apex and just had to be eliminated. So after that, they start something called the People's War on Terror, which from my research, it seems that all of the things that have been put in place more recently, since 2017, all of those things are being put together. There's kind of different experiments with the idea of re-educating people assumed to be extremists. There's regulations approved by the regional government that lay out what characterizes an extremist and how to identify them. And that includes somebody who advocates to follow religion. It includes turning down the hand in marriage of somebody from another ethnic group. It includes wearing any any kind of physical representation of religiosity, which are all things that any Muslim in the region, any believing Muslim would partake in. It's part of the religion. And that at the same time, they also start putting together this massive surveillance, electronic surveillance network that all leads into a giant database, which essentially serves as a file, an individual electronic file on every Uyghur that can kind of track their history of disloyalty, their history of religiosity. It can collate things like their telephone history, their history as tracked on CCTV cameras with facial recognition. It can track their internet browsing history, their communications, and it also includes like any information gathered by like community boards or their workplace and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And all this is being put in place already in 2014. And then in 2000, it seems that like late 2016 is when you really start to see this being transformed into what appears to be a systematic means of trying to essentially obliterate these people. We first start seeing a lot of procurement documents about building mass internment camps. People start disappearing. As far as for myself, just communications with Uyghurs outside of China, they began saying, we can no longer contact our families. We were told by our families not to contact them. We see that summer, the government asks all Uyghur students abroad to return to China. And we see some of those students kind of forcibly extradited from Egypt. We start getting more and more information about what's being put in place. And essentially it's been, this network of policies. I think that at the core is the mass internment centers, which include arbitrary detention, but have to be coupled with prisons, because one of the first actions the state does is start going after Uyghur party officials and intellectuals and religious leaders and putting them in actual prisons. And then you start seeing people being put into these mass internment centers that are allegedly for re-education or de-radicalization. And then the threat of being put in either of those penal institutions, along with the massive surveillance network, serves as a means to make everybody outside the internment centers and prisons compliant with whatever the state requires.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they're not, they will be placed in one of these.
Yeah, I'll ask one more question, and then perhaps we can turn over to the Q&A to Nancy. So it looks like there is terror in this, but it doesn't look like it is terrorist activity on the part of the Uyghurs, with the exception of that marginal group who are outside of China and do not have reach into China. But there is terror, and that is the terror of the state over the Uyghur population, which is enabled by the creation of the internment camps. The numbers vary, I guess, 1 million to 3 million, I've heard. And then there are prisons. If you can't graduate from the internment camps, which are presented as education centers by the Chinese state, you are sent to prisons. And then everybody who is Uyghur, who speaks a Turkic language and is Muslim and lives in this region, can be sent to any of these places at the will of some administrative officer. And that is a huge threat on the population, and the terror of and the threat of this looming possibility of being interned or imprisoned breaks the will or is designed to break the will of the people. Is this what you are referring to as the cultural genocide? So how does this lead to genocidal proportions?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's breaking their will, breaking any sense of solidarity. There's very obvious intent to, I mentioned that some of the first people imprisoned were any kind of cultural figures, any kind of people who had power in the party, and religious leaders. There's definitely been a focus on also destroying the Uyghur language. The people who've been put in these internment centers and prisons, their children are sent to boarding schools where they're being forced to study Chinese. And really, you don't have any access to kind of a socialization into a Uyghur culture. And simultaneously, there seems to be a very concerted effort to displace the Uyghurs from this region entirely. So, on top of this, there's been a massive program to put Uyghurs into residential labor production units in factories around China. And very recently, I think yesterday, a BBC report came out, essentially citing documents noting that part of the purpose of this whole program is to get Uyghurs out of this region. So if you look at cultural genocide, and I use that term as it's used often in anthropology in the context of settler colonialism, where you have a group of people who want to go in and settle an area, develop it, and settle it mostly with their own population, and to displace and break the will of the indigenous people so they cannot resist that. It seems very, very similar. And in fact, I would encourage anybody interested in this to just look at it in comparison to the expansion of the United States to the West and what we did to Native Americans. And it seems to very much line up and show the intent of the Chinese state to essentially destroy these people as a people.
With the difference of a century and a half or so in between. And with that, thank you. I'll turn over to Nancy.
And with the advantage of the narrative of the war on terror.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was so illuminating and so informative. I wanted to actually take the moderator's privilege and ask a question of my own before we get into the excellent questions we've been getting from listeners. And Sean, in the chapter on cultural genocide, and this really follows from what Mustafa was just asking, but in the chapter on cultural genocide, you describe a range of what you call spirit-breaking practices. And I got chills again, just saying that phrase, because you illuminated it so devastatingly in the chapter. But I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about the scale and the nature of that. And you were just sharing about the mass incarceration and internment of men. And I have to tell listeners, there's, if you look at the book on page 198, there's a picture of Uyghur men in a detention facility that looks so much like the photos from Kosovo that could have been from Germany. I mean, it's just a horrifying image. But so men being incarcerated and interned in these institutions, but also I was horrified and also fascinated to read about the coerced marriage of Uyghur women to Han men, which also solves a problem for the Chinese government of the one-child policy and all the girls that they sent to other countries. And so you talk about those coerced marriages that are very, very hard for women to refuse, particularly when there are men, the men in their communities are in these detention facilities. And then also the sending of the children to these boarding schools that sound for all the world, as you suggested, like what was done to Native Americans in this country and to other indigenous populations. And I think, as we go into the questions and discussions, if you could just get at some of the kind of granular personal toll of these practices by the Chinese state, I think that would help our audience to really appreciate the magnitude of this and why it is so appropriate to refer to it as a cultural genocide.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the people who have been in internment centers, there's a fantastic website that a group in Kazakhstan, with the assistance of a Russian American scholar, um, has put together of testimonies, and the people who have been in internment camps, and there's a lot of those testimonies on that site. It's called shahid.biz. But also a lot of testimonies have been received by journalists as well. There was a piece that came out in the New Yorker that talks about some of the reactions that people have had. Um, it's very evident that those people have been significantly shaken psychologically, and physically, and you can't always separate both of those. I mean, I think that it's hard to say which is more debilitating, the psychological torture or the physical torture. um, but for those people, it's very certain that their will has been broken, their spirit has been broken. But even people outside, early on when this was happening, I met a person who had just recently left the region, and the person told me horrifying stories of just waiting for the knock on the door every night. And the person had two children at home and was just terrified that they would be taken away in the middle of the night, because people were just disappearing. And so that also then becomes something that limits your behavior, that changes the way you act. You try not to express any kind of uniqueness of being a Uyghur. You try to make sure that you're not getting that knock on the door in the middle of the night. And you can find this, and I'm sure I wasn't able to attend the session earlier today. I'm sure I didn't talk about this. You can see this in the diaspora as well,
Mhm.
because they've been cut off from their families. um, they're they have incredible anxiety. They have the kind of anxiety that they're not doing enough, because they don't know, how they can help their family members who are suffering so much. So it's a very I think definitely a spirit breaking exercise that's being undertaken by the state. Whether that is uh, completely calculated or not, it's certainly the impact.
Thank you. We have a number of questions, and we do want to end at 5 o'clock, as we promised people we would. So that leaves us about 17 minutes. And we have a few questions about, for example, what can Americans do to help promote human rights for the Uyghurs? But I'll save 5 minutes at least for those at the end, but ask you some of the other questions that have come up in the meantime. One of them is whether you believe that the oil reserve in the area plays a role in China's desire to control this region.
Well, I think it plays a role, but the truth is that you can extract natural resources without destroying the indigenous people of a region. That's why settler colonialism is different than other forms of colonialism. I think it's really about more the strategic position of this region. In terms of China's economy, it is very much focused on export of production that's done in China. And the Belt and Road Initiative, there's varying assessments of how feasible it is, but it's certainly the intent of the state, the idea that they would be able to create this incredible connectivity with the world. And this region, sits in a location. I wish I had a map to show people. There's a map I have of it where it's just in the center, and you see that most of its borders are not with the rest of China. Most of its borders are with multiple states. And since the 1990s, actually, the Chinese state has been building in Central Asia those those roots of connectivity to the region even before the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think that that's more what is the intention. And I think, you know, initially the state looked at the indigenous population as superfluous to that. And then with time, it started to see the indigenous population as an obstacle to doing that and had to remove them.
Good. Not good, but thank you. There was another question about how the surveillance and persecution of Uyghurs has impacted other Muslim populations in China. Could you speak about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, there is, you know, in my book, I mentioned that the reasons this is happening now is kind of a perfect storm.
Mhm.
There's a lot of things that contribute to it. It's hard to kind of place one thing that is driving it, even though I think the settler colonialism is the overwhelming reason. But one of the things that's happening alongside this is the Chinese government is reevaluating its ideas about ethnic identity and the place of ethnic minorities in the state. And also, in general, is trying to control religion. So one of the things that we have seen over the last couple of years in the Hui Muslim areas of China is more and more limits on religion. At the very least, if not the destruction of mosques, the alteration of mosques to take, there's this attempt by the Chinese government right now to Sinify Islam and take away things that it has identified as coming from Arab Islam. And so one of the things, you know, strangely enough, is the domes on mosques. And the state has been going around and chopping off the domes, taking away, you know, anything on the minarets that would have a crescent moon or anything like that, sometimes taking away the minarets themselves. So there's certainly things happening to the Hui Muslims as well. But I would say it's definitely not, it has not gotten as intense. And that's a very interesting question to pursue for further study, why there is this difference.
Thank you. There was another question that I think speaks to your framework about settler colonialism as conceptual apparatus to understand what's happening here and what the Chinese state is doing in the region. And that was an invitation for you to compare what is happening to the Uyghurs with what has happened to the Palestinians, and whether you see interesting ways in which that comparison can illuminate things for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is, there are definitely some similarities, you know, and of course there's differences. But I think that one of the things that is different is there's been at least some international interventions in the issue of Palestine, right? You know, the Palestinian Authority still exists. You know, there's this constant encroachment of settlers. One of the problems I think that Uyghurs face is this region is completely closed off from the international community. The Chinese government for a long time has had this mantra about not interfering in our internal affairs. And so, I mean, to think, you know, a lot of people would like to see a UN inspection mission to the Uyghur region of China. And it's hard to believe that that could ever happen in a way that would be at all productive. Whereas I think in the case of Palestine, there's a lot more international attention, which is, you know, perhaps preventing things from getting to this stage. But one of the things I mentioned at the end of my book is I fear that this sets a very dangerous precedent You can see things happening like this around the world. The Israeli state's been more empowered in Palestine in recent years. We see the Indian government all of a sudden empowered to essentially go in and try to destroy Kashmir. We see in Brazil, Bolsonaro's government is going after indigenous lands. So this kind of like respect for native lands, I think it is at a point of deterioration in a lot of parts of the world. And this can set the kind of precedent that if nothing's done, it gives a lot of power to people to replicate it.
Really interesting and important point. And in fact, fossil fuel companies in our own country and are pushing anti-pipeline activism bills, which would aim at indigenous peoples in places like Standing Rock, who are trying to protect their resources and hitting them with what are called SLAPP lawsuits, but basically that would bankrupt activists who are involved in this. So really important point that we should see this as part of an enabling global phenomenon. So now to the all important question of what can we do, which was asked by a few of our listeners. And particularly, I think it's important for us to think about what can Americans do to promote human rights for the Uyghurs and to act on this. And you had some really, really thoughtful points in the book about that, including about the number of American corporations that are operating in China and in this region in particular, using coerced labor in some cases. And also this technology is coming from some of our giant technology, monopolies like Google and Facebook and such. So I think you might have some very helpful ideas to share with people who want to know what they can do now that they're aware that we need to be paying attention and trying to raise our voices about this. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to see the U.S. government do more, but I'm afraid that it's hampered in what it can do in certain ways. One of the things that's happened is that the Trump administration was very vocal on this issue, and the kind of pushback from the Chinese government on that was to say that this was just an invention of U.S. propaganda. And it was very easy to be able to say that about things coming out of the Trump administration, because they would frequently say things that were not necessarily completely true. There is a legislation in the U.S. Congress right now, which I think could be very powerful, that is meant to prevent Uyghur coerced or forced labor. And it's essentially saying that products with anything in their supply chain created by Uyghur forced labor should not be able to come into the United States. And this has wide ramifications, which is why I'm a little bit worried that it might not get passed. It was passed by the House, but now it's awaiting the Senate. And Apple and Nike and a lot of companies are advocating against it because it puts the onus on companies to ensure that it does not have anything in its supply chain that is involved in this mass residential labor program. And so but I think that is the general thing that can leverage change in China's behavior on this issue, is that if it does focus on economic issues, one of the things I mentioned in my book is I feel that this particularly has to be propelled by a grassroots movement that focuses on things like divestment, focuses on things like boycotts of any products that are coming out of the system. And there's some of that already happening, but I think it can become more pervasive the more we can uncover about what things are implicated in what's happening to the Uyghurs, what products. The problem is, of course, that most products that we buy in the United States have something in their supply chain from China, which means there's a pretty good chance that it has Uyghur forced labor in it. And so this would require some pain on the part of American corporations. But I think it's the only thing that would get some of the financial elite in China to realize that what the state's doing in the Uyghur region is not in their best interests, and that it would have to advocate that this be stopped.
Thank you. I'm going to ask to extend things for just a few minutes. I saw some additional questions come up. One, a couple of people asked about reports of forced sterilizations of Uyghur women. Is that something that's been corroborated by documentation in your own experience? And could you talk about that? And then there's one other that I'd like to wrap up with.
Yeah, no, there's been significant reporting over the last few months on this, and this is something that people who've been studying Uyghurs have been hearing about for decades, really, because China has for a long time had family planning as a kind of state function, right? The one-child policy. We'd heard stories for decades of Uyghur women being forced to put IUDs and by the doctor, or not even told, and having it done. But there's been more significant documentation that over the last 3 years that there's been significant attempts to limit births, and involuntarily. And probably the best evidence of this is that the Chinese government's own statistics that came out a couple weeks ago, they published an annual yearbook of statistics from each region, and for this region in particular, it shows since 2017 a 50% drop in birth rates to the present. And if that's accurate, one could assume that this is particularly that Uyghurs are bearing the brunt of this, that the Han population is probably less subjected to this, and that would suggest that among Uyghurs that would be even much more significant, because about 40% of the population in the region is Han.
Thank you. And a last question, into which I'll fold a few related ones concisely, but I think it's very important that this last question be from a Uyghur attendee who says, thank you, Dr. Roberts and Dr. Tuna. This is a great session. To Dr. Roberts, at the end of your book, you expressed a very dim view about the future of Uyghurs as a people, that they may disappear in the next generation or so. Can you elaborate this? And then goes on to say, it is so sad to me that the international community would allow this to happen in the 21st century. What happened to the never again slogan? And that is something that a few others raised too. Why has the international community been so slow to recognize this, to acknowledge it, to act on it? And are there signs that the Chinese government is sensitive to international publicity and criticism, which might also be a way of helping people understand how they might strategically raise their voices and come to the aid of the Uyghur people?
Yeah, so to clarify, I think, the real question is whether the Uyghur identity and Uyghur people inside China can be sustained. Whether the Chinese government will succeed in basically, obliterating, or at least, very least, marginalizing it so that it's completely inconsequential and detached from its homeland and culture. On the other hand, there were a lot of people who left China just prior to this because things were already getting very, very bad. I mentioned very briefly in our discussion, after 2009, there's this kind of steady flow of refugees, and thousands left, and none of them can really go back. One of the big worries right now is that there are people that the Chinese government's requesting to be extradited back in places like Turkey and Saudi Arabia and so on. But I think for, that portion of the Uyghur people is certainly going to maintain their culture, because one of the things I've found among Uyghurs is that wherever they settle, they establish very strong communities with very distinct identities. And that may be a product of being a nation without a state for so long, that they're able to create their own kind of governmentality without statehood. But I think the reason that there's not more international pressure, it's complicated. I think for one thing, it's important to note that the international community, unfortunately, excuse me, has a very poor track record of dealing with mass atrocities until after the fact. When we see states held accountable for genocidal acts or mass atrocities, it's usually after that state has been destroyed, essentially, has lost in a war. So I mean, I think that's one point that's important to keep in mind, and it's a discouraging point, and it's something that I think the younger generation has to think about, how we can actually ensure that is not a continued problem. But I think it's even harder to hold a very powerful state accountable. This has often been said about the United States, which refuses to be held accountable to the International Criminal Court. China is really in the same situation, and even more complicating in the global economy today. We're so interconnected that every state that is debating this question is immediately bringing up the issue of how is this going to affect us economically? Because it's obvious that right now, so much of the global economy is intertwined with Chinese production, and if you challenge China, they will respond by trying to hurt you economically. And so this is perhaps kind of uncharted territory, but I think it's also it's urgent that this be something addressed by the international community, and to see the UN really kind of take up its intended role to make sure that states are held accountable for these kinds of actions.
Thank you so much. There's so much more to know and to learn than we could possibly get to in this session. So I do want to remind people that the book is available, and it's just, so well written and so clear and so informative. I highly recommend it. And also, if you notice in the chat, Emily has added a few things that have come up in the course of the conversation. So the link to the victims database, a link where you can connect to hear about the conversation earlier today with Aydin Anwar, and also a link to the proposed legislation about the Forced Labor Prevention Act. So I think we will also at DHRC, when the video is released for this event, we can include some of those other links so that people can find more information and learn more and think about how they can become part of the solution to this, because it's something we all need to be talking about and finding ways to act responsibly and compassionately and passionately about. So I want to thank you both so very much. Thank you so much, Sean Roberts, for coming to present your research to us. It's been so powerful. And thank you so much, Mustafa Tuna, for sharing your expertise of the region and asking such helpful and probing questions to really bring out the fullness of this story. Thank you all for attending, and we will be sending out the recording as soon as it's available. We thank you all for coming, and we hope you will continue to learn more. I would also recommend, again, as I said in my introduction, checking out Professor Roberts' web page, which has actually some quite beautiful photography, as well as the documentary and some other materials for you to learn from. So again, thank you all for attending, and thank our two professors in conversation so much for educating us on this urgent issue. Thank you. Goodbye.